And
I never clicked on recording, so we can start now.
Yeah, and we decided to talk about a subject which obviously I think it's quite fascinating because of a variety of reasons which we'll discuss. And hopefully you do find fascinating the wines of Valpolicella and the territory at large. And I wanted to start actually with this line of a sentence, which brings me back to a very famous novel, which is known as Across the River and Into the Trees, which is a novel by Ernest Hemingway. And in this specific novel, which goes back to the 1950s, the Colonel Cantwell basically describes the wines of Valpolicella, and specifically the simple version of Valpolicella wines, as the light, dry red wine, which was as friendly as the house of your brother. Because truthfully, those wines, and we'll see, and hopefully you have some in front of you, it's what it is. You know, wines of simplicity, wine of immediate enjoyment, which obviously today has also evolved into like many other different styles. And this is a picture of Verona. So we're going to jump into, you know, a few things about Veneto specifically, which is the region where we are. And then we go a little bit more in depth, obviously, in what Valpolicella area is, where the wines are, the many styles and the factors that really affect and create these beautiful wines, right? Oh no, why is it not? Oh, here you go. So yeah, just to be very brief without too lengthy on this, but to give an introduction, because again, we are in the region of Veneto, which as you can see is in the northeastern part of the country. And the name itself of this region comes from an ancient population, the Veneti, which practically migrated from Anatolia. So we're talking about the Eurasian area already in the 9th century BC. So for a very, very long time, this population settled here. So as you can see, pre-Roman, you know, history here. And later, you know, obviously Veneto went and became part of the Roman Empire for a very long period of time. And it wasn't until the collapse of the Roman Empire that takes place in the 5th century AD. At that point, the territory with all the various, you know, barbarians, if you will, that come into Italy and take over the land. Practically the territory, it's split between the Lombards, which take over the inland parts of Veneto, and the Byzantines, which will form, you know, the Eastern Roman Empire, practically take the coastline part of Veneto. So in the 9th century, obviously, you know, with the Venezia or Venice, the capital city, becoming a very powerful marine republic, you know, the Doge comes into play. The Doge means practically the military, what would you call it? The military, basically the most important military person. As a matter of fact, it comes from the Latin word dux, and later on Mussolini actually will take that term when he turns in power. It's called duce, and practically for like a thousand years, you know, the Republic of Venice becomes the most important of the 4 sea or marine republics, which are Pisa, Venezia, Amalfi, and Venice really controls all the sea trades. As a matter of fact, it expands its territory, as you can see on the map below, all the way into the Far East. And this, we're talking about the times of Marco Polo's travels and whatnot. And this really gives a great importance, and most importantly, great wealth. As a matter of fact, the city of Venice, the way we know it today, in all its beauty and its in majesty, was built because of the many trades that took place during this 1,000 years of Venice in power. And then, you know, later on, obviously, you know, like everything else, it comes to an end, the domination of Venice, when the Napoleonic troops come and take over this territory. And finally, you know, Veneto becomes part of Italy in 1866, when the unification finally takes place. Now, geographically speaking, it's a quite unique region because, as you can see, 57% of the territory of Veneto, it's actually flatland. So you think about it, it's not really an ideal conditions for the vine for the most part. And also because the northern part also is quite a bit of mountains. So really the hills here only cover 15% of the overall territory. That being said, it doesn't mean there's no vines or no wine production, because actually Veneto is one of the largest producer of wines in Italy, right? A lot of it been bulk wine, right? We know all the varieties of Pinot Grigios and simple wines that come from especially the southernmost part of the region. But anyway, when it comes to the actual region of Veneto, there's boundaries like anywhere else. So practically Friuli would be right here to the east, Emilia-Romagna, would be to the south, Lombardy to the west, practically in the opposite side of Lago di Garda, and then also touches a little bit of Austria to the north, and obviously the sea coastline where the Adriatic Sea is located. Now, one big important and relevant factor for wine production, and especially for this territory we're talking about tonight, is the Lago di Garda, or the Garda Lake, which obviously is the largest lake in Europe, so has a major effect in wine production in these territories. And overall, this is a quite unique region when it comes to climatic conditions, because you got to figure, yes, we are in the northeastern part of Italy. Overall, obviously, northern Italy, it's cooler, much cooler anyway than the south. You have the mountains or the Alps right nearby. But at the same time, you have quite Mediterranean conditions because you have very long open coastline. And at the same time, you also have the Garda Lake, which really influences heavily conditions. As a matter of fact, this is the only place in northern Italy where you find citrus fruit trees, lemon trees, orange trees in northern Italy anyway, which is definitely not very common. So that tells you about how much impact, Lake Garda has in this territory. So this is just a different map that kind of it's a topographical map that kind of shows you the importance of the mountains, because practically this would be Alto Adige, right? The valleys. This is the northern part, of the Alps of Veneto, and right here, basically along the lines of the pre-Alps is where you find all the relevant territories for wine production, at least the most important. Might as well be the Prosecco area here, the DOCG of Conegliano Valdobbiadene. Same is true for, obviously, the Valpolicella Classico area, the extended Valpolicella, Soave, and all the famous territories that we know where great wines are produced. And obviously here is Bardolino, which is the territory, right on the shores of Lake Garda, right? It's just a different map that shows you exactly the same thing. Also here, kind of gives you an idea, at the base of the mountains, and we'll see more of this, but anyway, at the base of the mountains, you find the Valpolicella Classico, and then the extended part of the Valpolicella that eventually touches Soave, which is right here, all in the provinces of Verona, obviously. Yeah. And now we're entering the territory of Verona. I don't know if you have been. If you have not been, I strongly suggest Verona. It's a wonderful city. Obviously, it's a city of great Roman history. It's the second most important Roman city in Italy after Rome itself, as far as still, obviously, as you can see the arena right there, but many other Roman ruins, they're still incredibly well preserved. Also, it's a city of romanticism, right? That's where Romeo and Juliet took place, Shakespeare's masterpiece. And really, it's a very nice city, very small, very well kept, very elegant for sure. And the beauty of it all is that, yes, you are surrounded by vineyards. Really, you are 25 minutes, you're on Lake Garda. Like to the north, you have basically the Valpolicella area that kind of falls onto the city of Verona. And to the east, you're going to have Soave. So really a special place with great history worth visiting if you have the opportunity. And plus the many cafes, bars, nightlife, and whatnot, which is truly, truly special, right? So the first thing I wanted to touch upon, which is really unique and very special for the production of these wines of the Valpolicella, before we get into the territory specifically, are the grapes. Because here we have a bunch of different grapes. Some are more known, some are less known. Obviously, the ones that are more relevant and they are legally required to be part of the wine production. Others, which are complementary grape varietals, not necessarily a requirement. But anyway, all these grapes, they're referred to in Italy as uve uccelline, or the bird's grapes. There's a couple of reasons for that. One being that a lot of these grapes actually have a very dark coloration of the skin that reminds you of the, basically the plumage of the bird's feathers. The other one being that actually, because of the sweetness of the berries, the birds love to feed on them. And they all, or for the most part, many of them take the name from a type of bird, like as you probably already know, corvina obviously comes from corvo or raven. Rondinella comes from a spring bird known as the swallow, right? Corvinone obviously means like a big big Corvina or big, Raven. Same is true for Oseleta. Oseleta is just another slang word in Veronese, which is Oselet, means like a bird or little bird. And then obviously there's others like Molinara, which the name doesn't necessarily come from bird, but Molinara means from mulino or mill in Italian. The reason being because the berries themselves are always coated with a lot of this white bloom or purina that is a protein. But anyway, the ones that are definitely most important to mention, and they are required in the production of the wines, one being Corvina itself, which is a very unique grape because it's a thick skin, very dark skin, although interestingly enough, it never gives you wines that are going to be very, very dark, or at least they're not going to be like a inky purple or like black by any means, but the wines tend to be actually a dark ruby red in most, right? And also one of the uniqueness of Corvina, it's a quite a finicky varietal, so it just requires just enough shade, just enough amount of sunlight. And it's also a grape that naturally does not build up a lot of sugar when it comes to the full ripening moment of basically of maturity and harvest. But actually, because of the thick skin and because of the fact it doesn't have naturally a lot of sugar, it's ideal for the Apacimento process, which is incredibly important, especially for the wines like Amarone and the Recioto, the wines that are made with the dehydrated red grapes. Corvinone, for a long period of time, was believed to be basically associated or been sharing some of the DNA of Corvina, but they realized that actually there's none of that. So just the name has a similarity because the berries being larger, there is a resemblance between the two varieties, but there's really no genetic ties. So for that reason, it might have been confusing at some point, but we do know that actually there's no relationship there. And Corvinone actually has quite a bit of a tannic in the skin, or quite a bit of tannins, which actually Corvina itself lacks. So also delivers that structure and the tannic structure, most importantly, which otherwise you would not have on Corvina. The other one being Rondinella. Rondinella obviously takes only, and we'll see specifically the percentages and whatnot, but Rondinella is still relevant in the production of Amarone, obviously not as much as Corvina and Corvinone, because it does add an element of freshness, and also because the variety itself, it's very dependent. And you do need that in conditions like in the Valpolicella. You want to have the dependency of the grapes, you want to have enough harvest, because eventually, as you know, grapes go through dehydration, so you're going to lose some of the water. And then the other one that I obviously used to be relevant but is no longer these days, called Molinara, because Molinara, it's a grape variety that as you can see from also the picture, the skin is fairly light, so it gives you wines that at best might be kind of rosé-ish, faintly ruby red in color. And also because of the high acid, sometimes people believe that in wines like Amarone, where you want a lot of structure, a lot of extractions, a lot of body and whatnot, Molinara would actually dilute the wines a little bit. So that's why it was phased out, no longer required in the blends, although it is usable. And seems like there is a little bit of a comeback, especially with conditions getting warmer and more sugar in the grapes, and eventually the process of Pacimento and whatnot. Sometimes the wines can be a bit too alcoholic, too rich, sometimes almost like unenjoyable to a certain degree. So grapes like Molinara tend to actually play a role. And definitely another one that is worth a mention that you're going to see also in very rare cases, but you're going to see as a single varietal wine, is the one called Oseleta. Oseleta was a single-handed rediscovery by the Masi or the Boscaini family of Masi, because it's a unique grape. Oseleta has got very small berries, small bunch. As a matter of fact, here, it gives you the idea how small the bunch is in relationship to the other ones. And not only that, as I said, the small bunch, small berries, very thick skin. So there's not a lot of, juice to start with. Imagine when it goes through the process of Apacimento, which is quite common, you have a really, really small amount of juice that is left in the berries and lots of tannins because of the thick skin as well here. So you're going to have it's kind of like the Cabernet of the area. So it does add a lot of dimension to the wines, a lot of body, incredible structure, and definitely that kind of a fuller tannic component that would lack otherwise. So these are kind of like the grapes that are definitely most relevant. Then there's others which are complementary, but rarely you would see in blends. And also, some of the features of the territory, which we'll see through some other pictures of the Valpolicella specifically, one being this Marogne. So Marogne are basically these dry stone walls, because the territory is so hilly and very, very steep. So in a lot of cases, most of the cases, I want to say, they actually had to terrace the vineyards. So for that reason, you're going to see all these dry stone walls, which most of them actually historically were built with the basaltic rocks, because obviously Valpolicella, part of the territory of Valpolicella is a volcanic, ancient volcanic territory. And on the other side, an important relevant factor as far as the training system of the vines, probably the most commonly used is called pergoletta veronese, which means little pergola, or Veronese little pergola, which substituted, fortunately, the tendone. Tendone is basically the big tent, canopy type of training, which obviously would create too much shading, too much moisture, which also it's a big issue, especially for Corvina, unwanted mold, versus the pergoletta. Just gives enough shade, but at the same time allows for a lot of air to circulate, and so it's true also for the sun rays to come through and touch the grapes and whatnot. Obviously, Lasha, if there's any questions, you interrupt me. Feel free to do whatever.
Sure. At some point, if we could insert whatever you feel like the tasting as well, that'd be great.
The tasting, you mean of the actual wines?
Yes, because some members have purchased the wines, so we can kind of.
Yeah. Obviously, this once we get to the wines, we'll talk about the wines specifically with the flavor profile. In this case, I just wanted to touch the grapes. So this is anyway a picture that kind of shows you beautiful vineyard side with the the steep vineyards, and that's why you have all this. As you can see, it's a bunch of like different terraces, which is very, very common to find in the Valpolicella area. This is just another picture of the Marogne. This specific vineyard actually belongs to Andrea Sartori. This is the historical vineyard in the in the heart of the Valpolicella Classico with its typical rocks. And then we get into the territory, specifically of Valpolicella. So now, when you think about this territory, you kind of got to break it down in different parts, meaning that first and foremost, you would have the Valpolicella Classico, or technically it's called Valpolicella Classica because the name is feminine. But on the label, obviously, you see Valpolicella Classico Superiore, which is quite common. And this historical territory practically refers to the 5 villages, some of which are actually valleys. And these are Sant'Ambrogio, Fumane, Marano, Negrar, and San Pietro in Cariano. So these are the 5 villages, as you can see on the map below. But as it happened with many other territories in Italy, might as well be Soave, which is nearby, might as well be Prosecco area, might as well be the Chianti in Tuscany. And obviously there's other examples. The demand for the wines grew enormously. You gotta figure the Valpolicella wines here in the United States were already quite well known in the 1970s. Actually, they're some of the most well-known wines at the time, together with Chianti. And the demand was very, very high. So obviously they expanded the area of production, as you can see, in 1968. And the territory today, it's much, much larger. As a matter of fact, touches on the other side and overlaps on the other side with the territory of Soave. And so you kind of want to break down the area. In the middle, you're going to have the Valpantena, which is probably one of the other very important areas, or at least more recognized. And then eventually to the east, you have the area known as Valpolicella Estesa, or Eastern Valpolicella. Maybe not as famous, but you got to figure that, for example, in the Val di Mezzane, which is one of the Valle on the easternmost part of the area, you find one of the most important historical and also famous producer for great wines, such as Romano dal Forno. So sometimes it's not just about the Classico being the best by any means. Obviously, it is the area most focused. It is the area where traditionally you're in the middle of a variety of conditions, that and also elevations and slopes. But then again, also in the eastern part of the area, you can have some great producers and great wines, right? And this is a picture I got from Google Earth just to kind of give an idea what the territory looks like. As you can see, this is Lake Garda. This would be the territory, obviously, of Lombardy. There's a little bit of Trentino to the north, and to the east, these are the Lessini Mountains, which are basically low elevation mountains, if you will. And the uniqueness of this territory, as I said in the previous slide, is that it looks like the outstretched fingers of a hand. As a matter of fact, it looks like almost like the 5 fingers, 3, 4, 5, and in the midst of which you find all the various valleys. And down at the bottom, you find the city of Verona. So really quite special and beautiful territory. And up here, there is the highest peak, which is Monte Baldo, which is about 6,000 feet of elevation, right? So it's kind of breaks down a little bit what the uniqueness of the area is, because a lot of times, differently say the Barolo, where there's been a lot more study, there's been a lot more zoning, a lot more has been done, and it's true. Same is true for Barbaresco and a few other territories in Italy. Areas like Valpolicella, many times we don't mention, we just also because the wines obviously are blends, and because they're also blends of different parcels, we don't look at a single vineyard element, or we don't look at a village element. But there is to say that just by association, when you look at the towns of Fumane, Marano, and Negrar, these are the ones that have the, basically vineyards in the highest peaks, right? Versus when you look at Sant'Ambrogio, Valpolicella, San Pietro in Cariano, they tend to be almost like a sea level, if you will. Obviously, there are some vineyards going to be a little higher, but there are different elements that are relevant. And also with that, for example, in Fumane, where the average elevation is 200 meters, again, as you can see, the soils have their own definition. So these are calcareous soils. The wines tend to be, if they were only made from that specific village or that specific area, the wines would be, darker, denser, and definitely more intense and powerful overall. In Marano di Valpolicella, this is quite the unique area. It's the only area, or the only village here, if you will, where you find ancient volcanic soils. They're referred to as toari, and these are practically volcanic basalts. And here the vineyards also reach an average much higher elevation that goes between 300 and 400 meters, and the wines tend to be definitely more, mineral driven, definitely more aromatically intense and perfumey, if you will. Then Negrar, which obviously is the one to the easternmost part. This is like where the elevations start to kind of slope down a little bit. They go between 80 and 100 meters. And the wines are definitely tend to be a bit more, fragrant and definitely more elegant, maybe less powerful and intense overall. And then the other two, obviously, we have to mention, one being Sant'Ambrogio di Valpolicella, which is the one to the westernmost part. Here, the soils are, for the most part, sedimentary, calcareous soils. We got to figure this territory was once upon a time at the bottom of the ocean, just like much of Italy anyway. So obviously you're going to always have this limestone and calcareous, rich type of soils. And also here the vineyards reach a peak of 180 meters in the highest part. Overall, obviously the wines tend to be more savory and lesser acidity. And last but not least is the southernmost part, which is San Pietro in Cariano, closest to Verona, which here also you have elements of limestone as well as clay. And these are, anyway, grapes that if they were made individually into wine without being blended with the rest, these would be wines that would be meant to be consumed a lot younger. So you wouldn't necessarily age them very long. So they have definitely an early appeal, and the texture tend to be definitely more juicy and supple than some of the other areas, right? So it's kind of like a breakdown of the territory. And also, I mean, I'm going to mention much about this, but it's important to understand also that within the Valpolicella Classica, there are also a series of single vineyards, or crus, as they're referred to. And as in this case, for example, by village, it tells you some of the main names that you might have seen, like, Allegrini does a Palazzo della Torre, right? So that's the name of vineyard. For example, Masi does Campolongo di Torbe and Mazzano, or there's others, like San Floriano, which is also very well known. So there's the Lagrola, also it's a very well-known single vineyard. So there's a bunch of them that you might see on labels, maybe not so common, but they are out there and they're available. So now we're going to talk about the wines and obviously what you have in the glass. So when it comes to the Valpolicella wines, there are 4 different styles of wines that you can get, right? There is the basic Valpolicella, if you want to call it that. Then there is the Valpolicella Ripasso. These 2 wines are both obviously DOC wines. And then there are the Amarone della Valpolicella and the Recioto della Valpolicella, these 2 being the two wines are made with the Apacimento process, right? Obviously, the main grapes we talked about, Corvina, Corvinone, Rondinella, and a bunch of like other, complementary grapes. So this is just kind of like creating a setting, what you're gonna get out of this specific, area, right? So Valpolicella. Now, for those of you that have I don't know what everybody has in the glass, but for those of you that have just a regular Valpolicella, like for example, this one that I have here, Sartori, is the Montegradella, Valpolicella Classico Superiore. This would be the example on the left, right? So you can have a variety of styles. You can have the Normale, which is the most basic everyday wine. You can have the Classico, where meaning the grapes only come from that, geographical territory. And then there can also be a Superiore version, like the one that I have here next to me. Pratically Superiore implies that, just like in any other Italian wine, implies that there is a higher degree of alcohol. So by default, the vineyards are located on better exposed sites where you're going to get more sun, eventually more buildup of sugar, and it's going to give you this higher concentration of alcohol, which by default means the wine is going to be a little fuller, a bit more concentrated, a little bit more structured. When it comes to the wines, both examples might as well be Valpolicella Classico, just the regular version, or Ripasso. They both are made with the same set of grapes, meaning that you have to have a base of Corvina. As you can see, it's very relevant because Corvina, it's practically could be 95% if a producer wanted. It's rarely that high, usually reaches a max of 70, 75% in the blends, but Corvina definitely takes the lion's share of grape varietals. And then the remaining small percentage of Rondinella, between 5 and 30. And like I said, there's these other complementary grapes. But in the glass, when you look at the more basic Valpolicella, say that you have a Classico in front of you, because I'm not sure, obviously you're going to have a nice, typically a nice concentration of ruby, dark ruby, coloration. When you swirl the glass around, the most common, I want to say Valpolicella Classico, the alcohol tends to be around 13%. For example, this one I have here, it's 13.5, but this one is Superiore. So obviously there is that extra that you wouldn't find. Maybe the one you have that is the Bonacosta, it's probably 12.5, if not 13 there, right?
It's 12.
12. So yeah, so figure that's like lower, which is I think is nice, because I think in the case of Valpolicella, just like in that initial quote, you expect to have a wine that is very fragrant, right? You're gonna have always this quintessential cherry component, which is very common, especially in this area. We're talking about the area where the Marasca cherry comes from, very, very famous, the Maraschino cherries. And so you're gonna have all this beautiful dark cherry. Then you also have elements of blackberries, a little bit of plum, sometimes more on the sour type of plum, maybe like a reddish type of plum. And with that, the uniqueness of Valpolicella, there's always this herbal component, which always, I think, gives an element of freshness, like a balsamic note, which is really what I find enticing. Sometimes can be a little bit of maybe vegetal. I guess it depends on the the fruit and the specific harvest and whatnot. But I think that element of green freshness is always, very, very refreshing on the nose. Versus in the Ripasso, where most of things are similar, meaning you still can have a Ripasso that is Classico, Superiore, or from the specific area called Valpantena. What really makes the wines unique, obviously, as probably most of you already know, is this second fermentation, right? So Ripasso was a method that was created in the 1960s by Masi, where, was a moment where Valpolicella was getting a little stale. Overproduction was killing, momentum. The wines were getting a lot more diluted, lackluster, very simple, disappointing, to be honest. And so Masi decided and created this new process called ripasso. Practically ripassare in Italian means to repass or re-ferment. In the specific case, it practically meant that, at the end of the completion of the fermentation of the Valpolicella grapes, when you've created your Valpolicella basic wine, now you're gonna ignite a second fermentation by practically adding the leftover skins of the previous batch of Amarone. And because in those skins, you're still gonna have some level of sugar, some color, some, tannins. Obviously, what's going to happen is going to give you your otherwise simple version of Valpolicella, a wine of bolder flavors, intense coloration, higher alcohol. As a matter of fact, the wine, that wine was this wine historically, right? Campofiorin, which was first released commercially in 1968. As a matter of fact, at the time on the label, the wine was called Valpolicella Ripassos. And then Campofiorin was the name of the state. That doesn't happen anymore today because obviously after many, many years, this wine is no longer made with Ripasso, but that was the tradition of the time. They realized that instead of discarding the leftover skins of Amarone, which still had plenty to offer, they would re-ferment them with the fresh basic Valpolicella. So by default, the wines are going to be different, where they're going to have a more intense, darker coloration in the glass. So obviously that depends upon also producer, the amount of time spent, on the skins of the Amarone and whatnot. And but the wines definitely, they start kind of gearing up into the direction of an Amarone, if you will. So you start getting more like a dehydrated fruit, fruit notes. Maybe you don't have so much the floral notes that you would have in a regular Valpolicella. You start getting definitely more like, again, this is this dehydrated fruit, like the plum becomes a bit more darker in color. The cherry tends to, shift more towards the Morello cherry, or this dark, dense, thick cherry type of flavors and aromas. And also the wines, you start getting maybe a little bit more of like this earthier notes, maybe a little bit more of tar, which is quite a unique component, but it's still very present in the wines of the area. So anyway, there are two polar opposite wines. I don't know who has maybe Ripasso in their glass, or if you had them next to each other. Obviously, you would see that, like Lascia said, this Valpolicella is 12%. The Ripasso, especially today, they are tending to be almost like 14, sometimes even 14.5% in some cases. I think a bit too extreme. I'm not a huge fan of that, to be honest. I prefer the, like, say, Valpolicella or the Classico versions rather than this massive extraction of wines. But the wines have become very popular over the years. They've been around for quite a bit of time, over 50 years now. So people that enjoy a lot of fruit, a lot of juiciness, suppleness, higher alcohol, and full body type of wines, they tend to prefer, the Ripasso than the basic Valpolicella for the most part. But I think there's wine for everybody.
If any of the members wants to has wines and wants to talk about the differences that and describe the notes, please feel free to do that. Would be interesting to hear from anyone.
Hi.
Hello.
I'll tell you what I'm having. I haven't had the wine before, but I'll hold it up here if I can. Is it right?
The Laragosa, yeah, it's great.
Yeah. So I haven't had, this is the Valpolicella Ripasso Superior, and it is 14.5% alcohol, which I'm hoping, as it says in my glass, for the next 30 minutes or so, it sort of blows off a little bit. So I mean, I do get a little cherry, and I do get a little some sort of, some cherry and some floral notes, but it's a lot of alcohol right now. Maybe if I was eating something with it, I would enjoy it more, but I do like their Amarone, but I haven't had the Valpolicella Ripassos before, so
yeah, I get what you're saying. I never, I had before Amarone, maybe Valpolicella, never had the Ripasso from Laragosa. I always had the good memories anyway of the wines. But yeah, as I was mentioning, sometimes the Ripasso is being pushed over the edge by producers, because they're trying to extract as much as possible, trying to get the grapes. Obviously, the grapes are getting riper to start with, as far as the base grapes, right? And then with that, with the addition of now the leftover skins of the Amarone grapes, which have more sugar to start with, you're going to get wines at 14.5, which again, is it meant to be an Amarone or is it meant to be a Valpolicella? That's the problem. In my opinion, that's the problem with Ripasso. It's meant to be a wine that it's more a commercial, wine than anything else, because for export markets, that's what I was trying to say. Yeah.
And I have the same one that you have. This one is 13% alcohol. So I guess this is where the winemaking craft comes in also, and kind of the mix of the grapes, which actually was my question. So for the producers that have the different lines of Valpolicella Classico, Ripasso and Amarone, does the mix of the grape varieties percentage change for the wines?
Yes, although there is to say that many producers that I've seen, there's not a huge change, meaning you believe in your formula, right? Obviously, if you're making the Amarone, you're still going to have your strong base of Corvina, Corvinone, depending on what percentage you use those two, Rondinella, because those three are required no matter what by law. Then that third piece, if you will, or fourth, if you're using Corvina.
Ciro, we lost you. Uh-oh, let me text him.
Trade secrets.
Oh, Ciro, you're back. You're back.
Oh, sorry. The presentation is still sharing, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I was going to say, yeah, so that the third or fourth piece can be something that it's left to the producer. It might vary a little bit to create a house. So
What's going on? I'm not sure. Erica, would you like Ciro?
sorry, guys, I apologize.
No worries. You can. Oh, you're back. Okay.
Yeah, I was saying that's why producers a few years ago they decided to they voted and they also decided to allow international varieties to be used in the blend. I don't think many do. Those were more like the people that wanted wines even bigger, even darker, even more concentrated and alcoholic. But fortunately, it's kind of like not as relevant, I don't think. But anyway, just to answer your question, if you say that you're making a production from the basic Valpolicella all the way to the Recioto, for the most part, that tends to be the same formula, right? There might be obviously the removing of Molinara in one wine, and the addition of Oseleta if you have a little bit in your vineyards, but there's not going to be huge shifts. You're not going to see in one wine 45% Corvina and the other one at 85% Corvina, because also you're trying to create a style. And as a producer, you believe obviously that the quality, most producers know that the most important grape of the area is the Corvina. You're not going to do an Amarone with the 30% Rondinella. It's a rare occurrence. So, but also because Heather, what's the vintage of your wine? I'm curious because it could be also a matter of vintage. What's the vintage you have?
2017 for the Ripasso.
Oh, okay, it's interesting. Yeah. So yeah, it's the same vintage as the Masi, which is also set 2017.
I feel like I had the Valpolicella, not the Ripasso, just Valpolicella, and that was a lot lighter, like significantly lighter, but I can't recall the vintage on it. So
yeah,
I guess I'm surprised the difference between Valpolicella and Valpolicella Ripasso, that maybe for this producer that it tastes that different for me.
Yeah. Yeah, but obviously the wines are different because it's most producers, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to create a wine that is in between the most basic generic, but I think a lovely and lively, version of the wines, and obviously the big bold version being the Amarone, right? So this is just another picture that shows you really the natural beauty of the landscape with all this terraced vineyard retained by the Marogne, so the dry walls. And I'm going to talk about the Amarone and Recioto. Obviously, these are the two wines which are made with the Apacimento process. So these are wines that shift totally from the previous two. It all originates actually from the Recioto. So Recioto obviously is the sweet wine of the two. And it's a wine that in Roman history has always been very relevant. You gotta think about this gentleman by the name Cassiodoro. He basically was a senator of the King Teodorico. He was the first one to mention about such wines in the 5th century AD. And supposedly, today we call it Recioto, but the wines in the past was called Acinaticum, or in Latin Acinaticum. And these were wines that were made by the process of dehydration, which has been existing in the area for 2,000 years, right? But before we talk about, obviously, I mentioned the sweet wine first because that is the inception of today's Amarone. Because Amarone was born in the 1950s. As you can see, the first commercial Amarone was released in 1953. Practically a batch of Amarone, a batch of Recioto was left unattended and fermentation fully completed. And they basically gave us what we, at the time anyway, gave us what we have today, a wine called Amarone, which is practically a dry Recioto, if you will. That's why the name was given, being Amaro, meaning bitter, if you will, although wine wasn't necessarily bitter, but bitter in reference to the fact that the wine was dry compared to what they were used at the time. For 2,000 years, obviously, they knew the wines to be sweet, right? Obviously, Amarone has got in the short time there's been in existence, has done many steps forward. It's been very, very successful. Today we're talking about roughly almost 15 million bottles. So you got to figure it's an important part of the economy of these territories. And in 1968, it becomes also a DOC wine. In the 90s is when there's a lot of improvements in the vineyards, improvements in the cellar, so really elevated the quality of the wines. And as you can see, for the production of Amarone, just like for the production of Recioto, if you have an hectare of vineyards, only 65% of the grapes harvested can be used, because the idea is also to, obviously, if you have an hectare, you're not going to make all Amarone out of it, right? Because not necessarily all grapes from all sites are, high quality. The Apacimento, which is really this technique, which is very common in the area for 2,000 years, it's what gives the wine its nature, because practically after harvest, the grapes are laid down, and the grapes are dehydrated for a period of time that goes between 100 and 120 days. So obviously a long period of time. And for the most part, you reach a 50% loss, depending on the nature of that year. But practically, you have a 50% loss of water and incredible dehydration. The alcohol, understandably, is going to be a lot higher because the sugar component in these grapes, as a matter of fact, the minimum is 14%. Today, just like we saw, there was a Ripasso 14.5. You see Amarone that reaches 16.5, sometimes even higher, which I think it's, overly indulgent, but at the same time is the nature of what's happening, the nature of the conditions, and obviously and obviously the fact that you have a lot of sugar in the grapes. Now, when it comes to obviously some of the technicalities, as far as aging, the requirement is minimum of 2 years and release at the 3rd year. And for Reserva, it's 4 years. Also for Amarone, just like it could be for Valpolicella Ripasso, on the label, you can also have the name of a vineyard, right? As I mentioned, this is a territory with many vineyards, although we don't pay attention, or a lot of times producers don't put them on the label, maybe because they don't think it's relevant, but there is that element. And, because of the process, this very unique process of making the wine, Amarone, it's a dramatically different wine because the set of grapes is the same, the geographical territory is the same, but really what varies is that during the Apacimento, the high concentration, obviously the evaporation of water and the concentration of sugar creates eventually in the wines this condition of, if you will, of roundness. So the wines have a much higher alcohol, they're a lot suppler on the palate, they're much juicier. Also, when it comes to aromatic intensity, they're going to be bolder, fuller aromatic wines. The fruit here, or again, the fruit element of the bouquet is definitely going to be more on the drier side. So you start getting more like in the, dry figs and maybe more of a prunes, and you start getting the raisiny quality. But also with that, you get, tobacco is one of the elements. Also this beautiful, balsamic herbal note. It's part of it. Again, I'm saying that it's a gross generalization because every Amarone is a story, and every Amarone comes from a different, territory and vineyard site. But generally speaking, that's kind of like what you get out of an Amarone. It's going to be a wine that it really fills the palate. It's going to have a lot of full. Anybody's drinking Amarone? I'm just curious. Which Amarone, Erika?
The Mossy, the one that you
Costasera?
recommended. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I have the Zenato Classico 2016 Amarone.
Yeah, that's a very good vintage too. Obviously, Zenato is a good producer, and 16 was a great vintage as well. And those wines are probably 15.5 alcohol, I would say.
We are looking.
So sorry.
Oh my, yeah.
Ida, are you drinking the Amarone?
Yeah, I am drinking the Amarone della Valpolicella Classico 2016 Zenato, and the ABV is 16 and fat.
Would you like to do the palate? Sorry, don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you miss it, you're welcome to do it.
No, I can do it. Absolutely. It has an astringency still. It has dry plums or prunes, which is quite different from many other Amarones that we have experienced. My husband and I love Amarones, and we love Valpolicella, fundamentally. But I was expecting like dried cherries more than the deep prunes, deep dark dried fruit. A raisin, a little bit, but I would say that the taste of dried prunes or dried plums really supersedes it. It's beautiful. I must say, if I wouldn't have looked at the label that it is 16.5%, I wouldn't have guessed it. I would have put it into 15% ABV.
Yeah, I mean, that's key to what producers need to do these days. It's trying to, obviously with know-how and science behind it, and their skills, is to balance the wines, because most Amarone are today in that range, from 15.5 to 16.5 and whatnot. But the important thing is that, yes, you can have a glass or maybe two and don't feel, eventually you're going to feel the alcohol in a different way, but you don't feel the alcohol that is overpowering or overtaking your palate, which obviously it would mean the wine is unbalanced and would be unpleasant. The one I have here, just to show you, I mean, this is like another producer here. It's called La Dahlia, also because it's 16 as well. Like the one you have, this is 15.5. Again, I think that comes with a variety of factors. Yes, one being that how long have you dehydrated your grapes for, right? Apacimento. What do you have in the set of grapes to start with, right? Do you have mostly Corvinone, Corvina, and whatnot? Although those are the key. You have some Oseleta, which also brings in its own charge of sugar, and eventually, yeah. Or do you have the Molinara, which is just more about giving freshness? Again, it's about creating a house style, and that's really what's also relevant. But no matter what, the Amarone are going to be full-bodied wines. The uniqueness of Amarone, as you mentioned, the wine has tannins, although the tannins rarely are overpowering on Amarone because they're always so well masked by the amount of fruit, right? You can have all this like very round, very ripe and mature fruit, very complex fruit. So you rarely feel that dehydration in your mouth. Although there can be sapidity in the wines, there can be, an element of saltiness, but, rarely you feel like the tannins as you would, in a Sangiovese based wine, or even in a obviously in a Biolo even more so, and whatnot. But
we have two questions.
Yes.
One, what's the residual sugar in Amarone? And I know there is a certain percentage allowed, right? But yeah,
It's a certain amount of grams, not percentage.
Grams, okay.
And what is it?
It's been changed to 9%. 9 grams, because you used to be allowed to go up to 12 grams. And so in an effort to obviously have wines that are less everything, right? And also less sweet, if you will, on the palate. And then that tells you about the fact of how much sugar there is in these grapes to start with, right? And in spite of fully fermenting the fruit, you still have wines of high alcohol, and you still have a relevant amount of residual sugar compared to a bone dry red wine, right? Where you would have maybe 2.5 grams of residual sugar. But anyway, legally has been changed to 9 grams of residual sugar.
The maximum, okay. And then the next question is, when do they take Amarone grape skins and add to the Valpolicella for the Ripasso? Can you store them, the grape skins?
Well, you could, yeah. Basically, what happens is you get a figure that as far as the Valpolicella, right? You harvest the grapes, say in September, like second half of September. Grapes are harvested, crushed, fermented, and you're making your basic Valpolicella wine. You keep it in a tank, right? Meanwhile, as far as the Amarone is concerned, grapes are harvested a bit later, right? So grapes are harvested, then they go down through the process of Apacimento, which takes between 100 and 120 days, and then eventually grapes are crushed, fermented, and the Amarone is made. So at that point, the leftover skins, instead of being discarded, now you can pour over the fresh Valpolicella. So you don't really need to store them, because you're making the basic Valpolicella before you're making the Amarone, right?
So basically, you store wine for a few months, sometimes.
Correct.
Even longer, and then that wine goes on the.
It's basically re-fermented with the skins of the Valpolicella. So it's not like you're making the Amarone first and then you have to store the leftover skins. No, it's actually the other way around, just because of when the grapes are harvested, and also this 3 to 4 months period of time, which takes for, the grapes for the Amarone to be ready, right?
Yep.
Do you add a yeast at that time too, additional yeast?
No, there's no need for it, because you got to figure that besides there's a little bit of nature yeast in the grape, in the leftover skins, but also is the fact that the sugar will ignite the second fermentation immediately.
Okay.
I see. Erica, I see you've been tasting wine. Would you like to walk us through the palette of your Amarone?
I gotta pour the Amarone.
Oh, or
I was comparing, but I can.
yes,
Hold
please
on.
do tell us. We can. What are
Certainly,
you tasting?
I have the Valpolicella Classico, the Campo Fiorine, which I don't think is, as you said, not officially a Ripasso, but sort of the in-between style, and then the Amarone. So, and certainly progressively on the nose, you just get riper and riper. Like going back to the Valpolicella Classica, you get a lot more of that green, sort of leafy, red, definitely red cherry, a little bit of that sort of, I don't want to call it volcanic minerality, but there's something dark, sort of dark and earthy there. And that kind of transcends through all the wines. But as you go to the, the Ripasso style, or then to the Amarone, definitely it just gets riper and riper. And for the Amarone, certainly very plummy. Yeah, a lot of like raisiny character, which is probably from the Apacimento process, but still like very good balancing acidity and kind of this, again, that kind of dark, minerally, almost like coffee-like taste that balances out the sweetness. So it's not sweet, but it's
right. There's
just
also
the ripeness is sort of balanced by all of these other elements.
Yeah, I agree. There's also an element, I'm not drinking it right now, but I've had it before many times, and there's a savoriness to the wines, which is nice because it balances obviously the over ripeness of the fruit to a certain degree. So it's important to have that element of savoriness, herbal quality, which really gives a sensation of freshness. And in the case of Masi, obviously we all know it's not a small producer by any means. So because they make a decent amount, especially the Costasera, which is their, I can't call it base Amarone because it's not a base Amarone, but it's their Amarone Normale, the one I want to say they do every vintage, although they skipped 14, but pretty much in every vintage that's made, the idea is consistency, right? So the idea is that you can make vintage in, vintage out, unless it's a disastrous vintage, and you want to make sure the wine is consistent. And also the uniqueness of that specific wine, hence the name Costasera, which means evening slopes. So practically the idea is that all the vineyards from where the fruit for that wine comes from are facing west towards Le Garda, which practically means the grapes are capturing the sun pretty much throughout the course of the day, but most importantly, the end of the day sun, the setting sun, which is actually warm, but it's not actually hitting the grapes too much. So obviously that means it's not giving even more ripeness to the fruit. So hopefully there's a bit more elegance to a certain degree, because you gotta still think it is a relevant production type of wine. But and that's, as I mentioned, for any other Amarone, it doesn't matter if it's 14.5, 15, or 16. The key is really trying to keep the balance in the wine without feeling like you're really chewing on the wine, although in a lot of cases you are. But it's just also the nature of the type of wine, because the process by which they're made and defined, right?
And also, I feel like through Valpolicella Classico to Amarone, that herbal note gets more muted. It's more apparent in a Classico, and then it's less apparent in the other styles. I don't know.
I think it's understandable and the common that happens, because you got to figure by the dehydration process, you're gonna ignite certain aromatics in the wine, obviously more concentrated aromatics, especially ripe fruit, like stewed fruit, an element of maybe baked a little bit, hopefully not too much of that, almost like a cocoa and dark chocolate, but you start losing the element of freshness, which is understandable. Just like when you smell a fresh cherry versus like a dry cherry or anything like that, you don't get any more that kind of a floral as well as a herbal component, which kind of dissipates, or at least is masked. It will show up if you have an opportunity to taste older Amarone. That's going to come back because the fruit kind of subsides a little bit. But in young versions, which is what we're talking about, it's all about this primary, complex type of fruit.
I see. Yep.
Yep. And And obviously, probably the most interestingly enough today, the least known of all the wines in the area is the Recioto, right? Which is really the inception of it all, the historical wine that goes back to really over 2,000 years ago. Actually, the wine called the Acinaticum that we refer to as Recioto today, you got to figure during the ancient Roman Empire times, it was only second to the Falernum, right? The most important wine or the most valued wine of the times. And today, you know, we barely know about it because obviously we don't drink as much dessert wine anymore. The wines are pricey. People are on a diet every other day, and there's always an issue with the dessert wine for some reason. But also, interestingly enough, Recioto, it doesn't refer only to this wine, meaning Recioto della Valpolicella, being the you know, the sweet wine from the Valpolicella area. But in Veneto, most importantly, they have a variety of Recioto. They also have two Reciotos that are made with white grapes, one being Recioto di Soave, right? And the other one being Recioto di Gambellara, which is nearby, still made with the Garganega and a bunch of other grapes. But anyway, first, the most important name, Recioto, comes from the dialect word recha, which means ear, because you got to figure that traditionally or historically anyway, they would only use the ear of the bunch, right? They would only use the side part of the bunch because that was the part that was best exposed to the sun. You would get the sweetest grapes with higher sugar, and those would give the best possible Recioto, right? The best possible dessert wine. The grapes, just like, and I have some pictures, the grapes, just like in the case of the Amarone, were traditionally laid down on this Gratici, or but practically Gratici are the straw mats, which are still used, but today very, very minimally. And the grapes would be basically set in the fruttai. Fruttai was the highest part of the cellar, which is basically where the grapes would slowly dehydrate. This was done in a very natural environment, meaning open windows, when conditions are very different. The air would flow in, and the dehydration would happen slowly and evenly over a long period of time. Obviously, today things have changed quite a bit. Same as the Amarone, only 65% of grapes per hectare can be used. The Apacimento is pretty much same idea, same loss of water content. Sometimes in the case of Recioto, the Apacimento can go even longer depending upon how much sugar, how much alcohol you're trying to get into these wines. Obviously, you know, one of the challenges, and there's another slide that tells you about it, but one of the challenges in this area specifically, because you are, yes, on a hilly area that goes towards the valley floor, but because the conditions can get quite stagnant, you know, around the city of Verona and moving south, there can be a lot of moisture, and that can create a lot of unwanted gray rot, which is obviously a challenge. People do wish they have botrytis, you know, noble rot, but it's not always the case. So they try to stay away from it for the most part. And also in the case of Recioto, unique enough, there's also a very rare spumante version. It's probably the least you're ever going to see, probably a micro production overall, but it is there and it is available. And here it's where these kind of wines, if you had an opportunity to try, they're quite unique wines because you have obviously the amount of residual sugar, it goes up, you know, north of 100 grams, right? So the concentration is much, much higher. There is still this beautiful, you know, ripe fruit, and especially the Marasca cherry, this, you know, like dense, dark cherry. It's very, very present. And these are wines, again, the wines of the tradition, the wines that you have with some cheeses. The wines that you can have with some dry pastries, you know, very simple things, but traditionally known as meditation wines, right? You would have at the end of a meal by themselves. And interestingly enough, there was also the Amarone was considered a meditation wine, because when it first came to be, people weren't necessarily drinking Amarone with the risotto or with the stewed meat type of dishes or heavy polenta-based type of preparations, but we're really drinking Amarone at the end of a meal, just as a complement to the meal that they had, sometimes with some cheese, but no much more than that. Today, obviously, Amarone has become a much more relevant type of wine, and internationally speaking, right? And this is kind of like the situation. Basically, these are the classic Gratici, which are practically this bamboo, these racks made with bamboo straws, if you will. And interestingly enough, you only put a max 2 bunches on top of each other, because the key is that, first of all, the idea why you use the straw mats is because you don't want a flat surface. So that way you're going to have more air circulation underneath and in between the grapes. And it's also the fact why you don't put more than 2 bunches on top of each other, because otherwise, potentially, because the moisture, especially in a natural open environment, without temperature control, without AC, without fans, you can easily get mold and, ruin everything, right? But today, in reality, most of or in the majority of cases, it's happening like this, where basically grapes are put in this plastic crates, and then they're left there to dehydrate. And also, not only that, a lot of it today takes place because again, conditions have changed, everything has changed. So what's happening today, they can't count on Mother Nature anymore to give you ideal condition for the process of Apacimento or dehydration. So every producer pretty much uses this, large rooms where basically you have computers that control the temperature, control humidity, control moisture, control, ventilation. So practically they create parameters to give you ideal conditions for the process of dehydration, which ultimately will give you, consistent quality that will give you consistent wine year after year. Yes, there is still the element of that specific vintage is going to give you better or lesser quality of fruit, but at the end of the day, it's a lot more Amarone, much more than any other wine of Italy for sure. It's also it's really a wine based on the process of making, from the Pacimento to the dehydration to obviously the control of the environment where the grapes are dehydrated. And this is what you get, basically grapes that shrivel at times by up to 50%, and obviously this incredible aromas, and also this glycerin type of quality that is created by the Apacimento process, which gives you this definite sensation of smoothness. You rarely find edgy Amarone or sharp Amarone or very tannic Amarone, just because of also the process of dehydration. So this is something I think it's important to also realize, where Amarone, as much as it's a unique wine, it's a unique wine because it is a mix of both tradition, obviously the Pacimento, right? It's existing for 2,000 years, but also innovation, because obviously technology plays a major role, from the cellar to the way the grapes are dehydrated and whatnot. The different percentage of grapes we mentioned, although, they don't vary immensely, but there is an opportunity, a possibility to blend grapes, and also the role of rot, or noble rot, which in some cases producers have, although it's not very common, and then the air drying process, which obviously is very unique. But there are some concerns for sure when you figure that this data goes up to 2009. We're in 2022 now, but from 1972 to 2009, the hectares grew almost by 2,000 hectares. So a lot. Figure today, probably they've grown over another 3,000 hectares. And because of that, that has given way to lesser quality fruit coming from lesser sites, and obviously lesser quality overall Amarone. That's why in the market today, you also see Amarone, sadly, I'm not going to name names, but you see Amarone that can be very inexpensive, which by default means the quality of fruit lacks, the quality of site lacks, and the wines are at best Ripasso, definitely not Amarone, but that happens like anything else. When it becomes popular and you can make some money, things happen, right? So this is just one of this is the vineyards where Sartori's Corte Bra comes from. I have a picture because obviously I was there in June. Is historical vineyard, which is located adjacent to Villa Maria, which is historical property where the vineyards are for Sartori. And again, just another picture. This is probably another Amarone you might have seen around. Obviously, these are very old labels. It's called Serego Alighieri, which is the the property and the vineyards are still owned by descendants of Dante Alighieri, the famous Toscan poets. As he was exiled from Florence, he went to live the remaining of his life basically in the countryside outside Verona. And his descendants, over 650 years later, they still live in this area and the wines are still produced. And one of the unique factors about this wines and whatnot, I have a guest.
Awesome. Hello.
That's Valentina. Say hi.
Hi, Valentina.
She froze. I think it's too many people. But is that they still use, as the tradition was, these small cherry oak barrels. So these are basically, because you got to figure, as I mentioned, in this area, you had a lot of these cherry trees, right? And the tradition was to use the cherry wood to make the barrels. Although they realized that, although it imparted a very different flavor, very unique flavor, but the reality is that, first of all, the cherry trees are very small, so there's not enough wood. And secondly, they're quite porous, so the wine would leak out, the air would go in, and obviously the wine would oxidize a lot faster. So for that reason, nobody's is doing that anymore. Other than Serego Alighieri, they're still doing it for Masi's making their wines anyway for the last 50 years, but they're still, as a contract, they're still doing 4 months worth of time in cherry wood barrels before the wines get transferred to Slavonian casks, as basically a homage to the tradition of the area and whatnot. And then I just have a couple of,
Ciro,
oh yes,
sorry,
yes.
Before you move
Yes,
on,
yes.
that was one of the questions, if you could touch on the oak regimen of Amarone.
Okay, so it is totally left up to the producer as far as what type of wood, right? Mm-hmm. Now, within the period of time of 24 months of aging, which is the bare minimum required, 12 months have to be spent in wood. That's the legal requirement, right? But as far as the type of wood is totally left to the producer, as I mentioned, really the tradition of the area was to have these cherry wood barrels. But we're talking about times when there was a lot less wine, and there were a lot more trees in the area, which obviously is not the case anymore. Everything has been overtaken by vineyards. Today, I would say, as far as Amarone is concerned, for the most part, tends to be large Slavonian casks. There's a mix of different sizes. When I've been to wineries in the area, I've seen all sorts of things, meaning I've seen tonneaus, I've seen enormous barrels, which are really the tradition at the time. Today, I think everybody goes for mid-size. French oak, it's something more rare than not. Like some producers like Dal Forno, which is all about incredible, massive wines, great extraction, creating also in the wines these elements of like spices and vanilla and sweetness, even beyond what Amarone delivers. Some producers do that, but I would say it's not super common to have a French barriques, not as much as anyway Slavonian casks.
And in terms of, there is one more question in terms of aging. And Susan, if you could clarify, she's asking how long can you age Valpolicella and then Amarone? Susan, are you asking each one? How long can you age Valpolicella and Valpolicella Classico versus Amarone? Is that the question? And if you could touch upon that too, Ciro.
Yeah, so obviously regular Valpolicella, say Valpolicella Classico, because that's probably the most relevant example. I would say 5 to 7 years. You don't really. I mean, it could age longer, right? But at the same time, it's a wine that when you enjoy, you want that really liveliness, freshness, vibrancy, immediacy, right? The bright, Bing cherry and floral notes and all this fun stuff that really captures the nose, aromatically speaking. It will vary a little bit, but I feel it will fade more than necessary. So you don't necessarily want to age a Valpolicella longer than needed. Let's put it that way. In the case of Amarone, obviously we're talking about a very wide spectrum of potential aging as far, or possibility of aging, meaning that you can have certain Amarone that can age easily 40 plus years. It's dependent upon a variety of factors, like, you know, just because we have this example here of Masi and we're talking about it, Masi makes 5 different Amarone, right? The Costa Sera, which is the one Erika has, is their classic Amarone, and that can easily age 25 plus years, very depending upon the vintage, right? But they also make a Reserva, they also make 2 single vineyards, they also make this wine. But I would say a good Amarone can solidly age 25 to 30 years. I've had the experience actually with this specific Amarone, Serego Alighieri, somebody that retired from Horizon. This was 2008, maybe, I don't know. He gave me a bottle of the 1979 Serego Alighieri, and I opened it in 2009, maybe a year after he gave it to me or something, just for fun. Actually had one of these labels, the old labels, and the wine was still amazing. So at 30 years at that point, and oh my God, did I get disconnected? Oh,
No,
am I
we can
Oh, I
hear.
thought I was disconnected because I saw everybody, nobody moving. I was like, oh, don't tell me. And I remember the wine was amazing. It was like basically the color of a Tawny Port, right? All this massive inky purple dark color that you see in an Amarone now, it totally dissipated. It was like more in this kind of a slightly brownish, muddy type of color. There wasn't, obviously the fruit, there was a little bit of that, but it was more about spices. It was almost like you know, almonds and walnuts, and you know, almost like a potpourri, you know, dried out flowers. So it was very unique, very beautiful. Maybe that was an extreme because you're going, I wouldn't have waited any longer than that. I would say definitely with the drinking window for an Amarone between 10 and 15 years is probably when you are in a great spot, depending also vintage and producer and whatnot, but you're in a great spot because the wine has had enough time to start evolving and changing, still having that vibrant primary fruit, but also now, you know, converting into like more herbal, more savoriness, and more of this like tobacco, cigar, and, you know, cocoa that really give a lot more complexity to the wine rather than just a lot of fruit, right?
Yep. And another question is, can Apacimento better be used in white grapes? That would be the Recioto di Soave and Recioto Gambellara, right?
Yes, it's true for the production of sweet wines. It's also true that producers today, they can do, like for example, Sartori does one of their white wines with grapes from the Soave area. Obviously, they make a Soave, the traditional, you know, dry style Soave, but then they also decide to make another wine. It's not a DOC, obviously. It's just an IGT Garganega based wine, where practically about 15% of the fruit is dehydrated for about a month. So practically they only concentrate a small piece of the fruit that they have, and after the fruit is slightly dehydrated, they add it to the wine that has been made with the fresh fruit. So that gives a more, obviously, concentration, complexity, richness of aromas to the wines. It can be done. It's allowed. You know, Veneto, as I said, in general, outside of Amarone, as you saw in the slide, it's a wine that is, it's a region where producers are very open-minded as far as a technological approach and innovation. They're not afraid of, sure, they keep the tradition of certain elements as far as grapes, as far as Pacimento, but they're open-minded about creating new styles because again, people might get bored by drinking the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And so, so these are some of the, okay, so these are obviously the cuisine also. I like to put a couple of things because the region is very rich in a variety of foods, and obviously cheeses are very relevant. Some of the more known cheeses that you see commonly also here from Italy, like might as well be Asiago, Montasio, you know, Grana Padano, Piave. Obviously, these are names of river or mountains, right? Which is really the ideal conditions where the animals graze and then eventually produce the milk for this specific type of cheeses. But the cuisine is very rich in a variety of cheeses, which I think it's really fantastic match to drinking this wine. You pop a nice bottle of Amarone, you have a couple of great piece of Grana Padano, which obviously is kind of like a, if you will, now I don't want to be, I want to say blasphemy, but it's a younger version of Parmigiano Reggiano, you know, less austere and very delicate on the palate, and can be great with an Amarone. But same as Piave, you know, this fresher version, you know, obviously more dried out aged versions, which are very, very nice. And then also the cuisine in general, in Veneto, you got to figure there's almost like two different types of cuisines. The cuisine of the sea, because of the very open area, you know, by the coast, which is more Venice, if you will, where you find dishes like, you know, the squid pasta like this, very beautiful, or this, which is baccalà mantecato, which is a very unique preparation of making baccalà. And then you have the cuisine of the inland, when you start moving more towards the city of Verona, where you start getting much richer flavors, earthier, you know, elements, meat-based, polenta, and things like that. And obviously Amarone plays a very relevant role also in the making of risotto. Although today it's, I think, well, locally you can still have risotto with Amarone because it's the basic Amarone. But home, obviously, you're not going to open a bottle of $70 and make a risotto. I would say use a Ripasso, because Ripasso has enough flavor, enough concentration to give you richness of color and intensity of flavor. But then you drink the Amarone if you wish to do so. And then, you know, yes, braised, stewed meats, you know, very concentrated flavors, which I think they do. They pair up quite well with you know, also the intense flavor of Amarone, right? You're not going to have that with a Branzino.
Ciro, from the cheeses that you showed us, are there any like smoked cheeses?
No, these two that resemble, these are like a caciotta, which is a typical cheese you see in many parts of Italy, but nothing smoked, not these ones. This one, like it's a taleggio,
I see.
right? Which is also obviously a softer, fresher, stinkier type of cheese, which is delicious, I think. Asiago, I love the good Asiago. It's really beautiful. But no, none of these is like a like a smoked cheese.
For some reason, Amarone made me think of the pairing it with a smoked cheese.
I think it's worth trying. I mean, I love smoked cheese, but none of these specifically are. But then again, the quality of smoked cheese or the element of smoked cheese is fairly present in many parts of Italy. So maybe it's worth trying, you know?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Any other questions, guys?
I'm gonna get out of this.
Well, I think we don't have any more questions, looks like. Ciro, thank you so much. Thank you for, coming back and sharing your passion, love for Italy, and supporting Boston Sommelier Society always.
My
Very
pleasure.
appreciated.
Always a pleasure. You know that the only issue I have is that you're an Inter Milan fan, but besides that, I won't blame you for it. Oh God, I'm gonna shut off the camera.
I have to play a game, so this is what I'm wearing, just to remind you.
See, I wanted to be professional. I didn't wear an AC Milan shirt today, but no, it was great to be here. Hopefully, you guys all enjoy a good glass of Valpolicella, Amarone. The beauty, I think, of this area more than anything else, because it's the same territory, the same set of grapes, is truly the process, and obviously the producer's style, but the process that defines what and how different the wines are from one another, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's always so interesting that from same set of grapes, the wine making this difference, and especially that every producer, as you mentioned, kind of concentrates not only on the quality of the grapes, but on their proprietary kind of formula of arriving into their style. And that's like a lifelong pursuit of perfection. And it's probably fascinating to notice those differences and nuances.
True. Yep.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Have a great evening, everybody.
Have a good evening. We have a Monday tasting at Newbury Street in person, and then we'll see you in a month for the wine tour of Greece on the February 28th. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chiro. Bye.